All right, a quick little look at this imperialism. Some of the questions are going to be in the midterm. Um, so we talked about this. Americans become more imperialist after the Spanish-American War, where they basically find themselves in the possession of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and why we become imperialism imperialist again. Mostly it's because of economic reasons, I think. There are some other reasons, of course, but it's a way for Americans to project power around the world and basically at the time find foreign markets is a big thing for your products. And again, if you have colonies, that's a built-in foreign market and it's a way to get raw materials. We don't think of this nowadays. It's not a modern way of looking at economics, but at the time, 1900, it is a very valid, well, for them, it's a very valid reason. It still didn't make much sense. But one of the things I'm going to ask you in the tests is this monism. It's this, there was a book written by this Admiral, Mr. Mahon, talking about how the U.S. needed a large navy to basically project its power and protect its economic rationale for being in the world. If you have a strong navy, you can open up shipping lanes and the free trade will flow. So that's what we need, a strong navy to continue our economic expansion. And again, why it's in the test is because it's the same thing to this day, right? We have a $600 billion yearly appropriation for our defense spending in this country. It's a huge amount of money. And one of the reasons are that it allows for the security. We are the policemen of the world. We have the largest navy by far in the world. That was I was talking about last time. So, and again, a lot of American politicians still believe that we need this large, again, navy to protect ourselves, and it's true in a way. So, just know this monism. You see it every once in a while, written down. It is, should we spend all this money every year on our navy? By far the biggest navy again in the world. And you can see on this slide, we did invade a lot of different countries. Whoa, sorry. During the early 19th century, again, Roosevelt is a progressive politician at home, but not so progressive overseas. And again, another multiple choice question is talking about this Roosevelt corollary of 1904, where basically if the U.S. will intervene in South and Central America, if those countries fall into debt or have problems with European nations, we don't want European nations basically coming into our hemisphere and collecting debt, which was the problem of Nicaragua at this time. Basically owed Germany a lot of money. There was a revolution in Nicaragua. They did not want to pay off to the Germans. The Germans were threatening military intervention into the Americas, and Roosevelt will say, no, if you have a problem, we will invade for you, and set the record straight. So it is very, heavy-handed by the American administration on Central and South America. So a lot of Central and South American countries remember this really well. They're taught this in their textbooks. We don't really talk about it in our textbooks as much. Taft, who will become president after Mr. Roosevelt, again, Mr. Roosevelt is vice president, he introduces this dollar diplomacy. And again, this is another multiple choice question because we still use this to today. The U.S. government, a lot of times, if a private business wants to do loaning money, doing business overseas, it can be risky sometimes, especially if you're doing it in the developing world, in these countries that are struggling economically. So the U.S. government wants to basically have U.S. business interest overseas. It kind of projects an American power and American influence. So dollar diplomacy, what it is the U.S. government will basically ensure these investments by private American businesses. So if a bank is going to loan money to a company in Honduras to make some purchases, the U.S. government will basically insure that loan. So if it goes bad, again, the bank will lose the money, but the U.S. federal government will pay off the bank. So in a way, it's a plus for Honduras because a lot of countries, a lot of U.S. banks would not loan money to these developing countries if they didn't get this backing by the U.S. government. Um, so the dollar diplomacy, we use it to this day, right? We have the Export-Import Bank. It's a way to project American power around the world, economic power, influencing people. It's a fascinating look at our past. Again, Mr. Roosevelt, some of these cartoons, again, his great saying, speak softly but carry a big stick. His big stick, again, is that U.S. Navy, which is his cartoon on the right here, is him leading the U.S. Navy around. So you can see on this slide all the places we've invaded in the early 20th century. And again, these countries in the Caribbean and South America, Central America, understand this really well. Again, Mr. Trump just a couple of weeks ago threatened Venezuela with possible U.S. military intervention. And again, we intervened in Venezuela in what was the year? In 1895 and 1896. So they read about that in their textbooks. They see this, again, new threat with Mr. Trump to deal with Venezuela in its crisis. They know that history. American students don't know the history that we basically invaded Venezuela. So again, here's more about this Roosevelt corollary again. This base, again, we want to project U.S. power overseas because, again, in a way, this is if we have a lot of goods, our factories, our corporations create a lot of goods, sometimes we need markets for those goods. And again, the U.S. has to look abroad for new markets. And again, the U.S. Navy is a way to protect those routes to those markets. And we still have it to this day. So again, American imperialism, we have done it because it's our American destiny, it's our mission, because we do things so well. Once in a great while, we do humanitarian aid to different countries. There are a lot of religious people that do this, not by the government, but again, there's all kinds of, especially in China in the turn of the century, there's all kinds of missionaries going there. But normally our imperialism is a capitalistic motivation, right? New markets. We can sell our goods, buy raw materials. That is our basic capitalistic motivation. Recently, it's been about national security again with terrorism. It was national security in the Cold War. Was our reason to be more imperialistic, but competing with Europe somewhat. Again, that's in the old days, not so much anymore. Communism, I'm probably going to talk about communism in the class because this, Mr. Lenin, if you look at Vladimir Lenin, the first successful communist leader that actually takes over a country, takes over Russia in 1917, he goes against the classic communism that Karl Marx creates a few decades before. And, Karl Marx is a German does his famous work while he's in London because he gets kicked out of Germany. But again, Mr. Marx wants to have this classless society, an egalitarian society, no money, no private property. But for this revolution to happen, this, he calls it this dialectic to come about, Mr. Marx, the whole world must become extreme developed capitalist. The whole world must be like Germany. Germany at the time is the most capitalistic country. Germany and England around in Marx's time. So when the whole world becomes very capitalistic, just a few people will own everything, right? Against like income inequality today, where we've got the top 1% that own so much today and get so much of the national income. Marx would say that's how capitalism will turn into, where just a few people own everything. And then there will be a revolution of the workers against this ruling class. Mr. Lenin is from a poor country. Russia is a poor country at the time, not a developed capitalistic country. And he wants basically revolution in his lifetime. He wants revolution now. So he comes up with a new theory of communism. That's why it's called Marxist-Leninist, if you heard of Marxist-Leninist theory, where these capitalist, developed capitalistic countries like Germany and England are sucking the blood out of these poor developing countries like Russia, uh, like China, and that's basically propping up these developed capitalists, and it's keeping them going by exploiting these underdeveloped countries, these underdeveloped nations. So for Lenin, this is his rationale. If there's a communist revolution in these developing nations like Russia, again, this will bring an end to capitalism, faster. Because Marx had it wrong. He didn't see that these capitalist countries were exploiting these smaller, less developed countries to such an extent. So this is what we're going to see in the Cold War, especially when it comes in the 50s and the 60s. Marxist Leninists are trying to promote revolution in every country, basically developed country around the world. In Africa, every country has a Marxist-Leninist, basically revolutionaries trying to overthrow the government. Same thing in South and Central America. Um, so that's why it's going to be a multiple choice question on the test about Leninism, where basically Leninism is, again, as it says here, that these capitalists are propped up by exploiting underdeveloped nations. So if there's a communist revolt in these developing nations, that will bring about the end of capitalism and the onset of this utopian society of Marxism. So hopefully that makes sense to you. All right, and again, at this time, here's imperialistic Africa. Again, all these countries are basically divided up. Their borders are set by a bunch of Europeans with negotiation between European nations, who should have what. So these are artificial borders. Again, there are all kinds of different racial groups and different ethnic groups in Africa that are mushed together in different nations, and of course it's had all kinds of problems in Africa because of that. But we will talk about the election of 1912 next week. We're going to talk about Mr. Woodrow Wilson, our last progressive president for a while. He's an interesting man. Again, in 1912, if I can find it. Again, Roosevelt wants to come back. Taft is the president in 1912. He's running for a second election. Teddy Roosevelt, is also a Republican. He wants the Republican nomination, but he loses to Taft in the Republican convention with a lot of strange events going on that Taft gets more delegates. So basically, Roosevelt runs on his own party, the Bull Moose Party. This is where you see the Bull Moose here. And then Taft and Wilson, as you can see, split the vote, and Wilson becomes the president. Eugene Debs, the interesting gentleman, the socialist, gets 6% of the vote. But this is when Wilson will become president in 1912. Again, he is also a progressive politician, except when it comes to African Americans. He is not that progressive with that. Basically, a lot of federal administration jobs are a lot of African Americans working before Wilson comes in. When Wilson comes in, basically those offices become segregated. A lot of African Americans lose their jobs. It is not a good time for African Americans when Wilson comes in. He's basically a racist. If you read his writings, he is very racist. So we'll talk about Mr. Roosevelt, or Mr. Wilson next week. But again, here's a multiple choice question. It's all going to be in the test that the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve Bank, that basically is the policeman for all the banking system in the United States. That comes to being in 1913. It's because there is a bank panic in 1907 that gets out of control. The private industry can't stop it, and politicians everyone realizes that we need a big, large federal organization to watch over our banking system. So I will talk about this in class, but this is also another multiple choice question. What caused the Federal Reserve to be created in 1913?